The small town of Honobia, Oklahoma is home to a multitude of different events regarding Bigfoot. All of them tend to be highly controversial. To this day, there's still many questions that need to be answered. And we went down that journey, and tonight we're going to tell you what we've discovered. Before that, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. We are SeaBro, the Southeast Bigfoot Research Organization. I'm Jaster, and this is Kaz over here, and tonight we are going into the Siege of Honobia. Back in the year 2000, these two brothers bought some property in this, basically, I believe it's called a incorporated municipality, which is more or less a step below a town that exists out in rural Oklahoma. And this place had a lot of rural area around it, and it hosted a deer migratory path. Now, the big hook here is that they also moved their families indoors into this property. And whenever that happened, they started needing to get a lot more food. They started needing to get a lot more resources. So they started harvesting the deer that were coming by. And they were starting to process them on property, store them on property. Now, many months went by, this wasn't too much of an issue, and all of a sudden they started realizing that their deer meat started going missing. This is the most understood version of this story. We're going to be citing the versions that Sasquatch Chronicles provided because they were the ones that talked to the Humphreys initially, and then we're also going to be referencing the BFRO interview with Dixie Cryptid because this is also one of the few times that both involved parties have been able to be seen on record talking about it. So we're going to get to the bottom of it, and we're going to add in our own investigation here at the end.
Well, the Siege of Honobia is a pretty significant case because I think well, for one, it's one of those rare cases where the Sasquatch activity in the incidents in question is outright hostile, which, as we have discussed before on the show, is very uncommon. The general backstory is you have these hunters who are, hanging their meat in a meat locker behind the house, and this starts attracting some squatches in the area. And these being some good old boys in the backwoods, they immediately get their guns and start shooting at them to chase them off. These squatches did not take kindly to this, and what begins is a small backyard war between these hunters and these Bigfoots.
So let's go ahead and wind it back up again, or wind it back up a little bit. So there was a period of time where they decided, okay, there's some weird stuff going on. We're missing food on the property pretty consistently, but we're not really seeing any indications of a break-in. That's also because this shed, for lack of a better phrase, isn't the most structurally sound thing, ain't the most thief-proof device on the entire property, let's put it that way. So they decide to start posting out, getting some cameras, start getting some lights, and trying to illuminate the whole area so they can get a visual on whatever's happening. So eventually, the activity starts to ramp up, like Cass was saying earlier, and here we go. Now we're starting to see these things creep out into the wood line. They're starting to show themselves a little bit more. Then, next thing you know, they're starting to come up to the house. And that's when the family started to see these things, not just the two brothers. This happened for a couple of weeks where the family were seeing these things like coming up to them at night, like through the windows, showing their teeth at them, trying to scare them off. And like Kaz was saying, they would go out and start shooting at these things. Well, it escalated to a point where the two wives decided to pack up the kids and leave so the two brothers could just handle this whole problem themselves, and then just when it's done, the family can come and move back in. This is where everything really started to shift because the entire objective went from trying to understand what the problem was to actually getting the problem solved.
So the BFRO was called in, and they arrived with a team of investigators. It is also worth noting that this is the point where the story gets a little muddied. There's a lot of finger pointing on both sides, and he said, she said, about the following events, but I'm going to describe them as they are generally told in the usual tellings of the incident. The BFRO team arrives, and the hunters and owners of the property are at first receptive to them, because they obviously view them as the help that they've been hoping for. The BFRO investigators, unfortunately, are more interested in using the property than they are giving any kind of comfort to the owners and helping, relieve any stress that the situation has been causing. What also does not help this is that apparently there was a rather elderly individual who had been brought along as part of the investigation team as well, and allegedly they spent the entire time sleeping in the truck, which the residents did not take kindly to. Tensions began to rise between the residents of the property and the investigation team because the residents were under the impression that the investigation team was going to solve the problem for them. And when the investigation team told them that's not what they're about, they weren't very happy about that. The investigation team then offers, hey, we'll pay you so we can use the property for some research and maybe get some notes on this. And the property owners were not very happy about that either, because this is where they lived and worked. They weren't just willing to hand over their home to a bunch of strangers so they can do some kind of field report. That's not what they wanted. So, with nobody happy, the investigators leave and nothing has changed.
With this is when the whole story blew up across the internet, because at this point, the Humphreys have had dealt with this problem for a long time. They tried to reach out to who they believed to be the professionals in this situation, and they failed them as well, so they decided to go on and see who else they could share their story with. And that's whenever the people down at Sasquatch Chronicles comes in, because they ended up talking to the brothers for a while. They ended up getting their story, and they were able to publish it on, I think it was like the 9th or the 11th episode of Sasquatch Chronicles. And it became
It's a very early one.
very early, and it's one of the ones that ended up blowing the whole thing up. Now, the big thing about the Siege of Honobia at this point is that it was really just the BFRO or not the BFRO, it was really just Sasquatch Chronicles that had their narrative out in the water, and had been this way for years. But it took a while for this story to make the rounds, and whenever it became much more prominent in the eyes of the internet and the eyes of the Bigfoot community, it was time for the BFRO to actually weigh in on what happened, okay? So, for those of you who maybe aren't the most into this kind of thing, there's a place called Dixie Cryptid out there that does a lot of people's stories about cryptid encounters, supernatural, paranormal encounters. And he actually did a interview with Matt Moneymaker, the founder of the BFRO. And there's a lot in that interview. It's like a 2-hour long interview. A lot of it has to do with how the organization is organized, how you can get in, how you're supposed to vet yourself to become an investigator. But at the end, there's a very interesting part of the interview where he ends up going into the Siege of Honobia itself. Because, let's be clear here, there's like 5-6 different narratives of what's going on. The one where Matt Moneymaker is apparently on the ground at Honobia is completely untrue. It doesn't say in either report from the Humphreys or from Matt Moneymaker that Matt Moneymaker was there at all. He was the one that directed all of these hunters, or all of these Bigfoot researchers, to that location. He was never there. The Humphreys didn't even claim he was there. Now, the other thing to note is that the 70-year-old wasn't even an investigator with the BFRO. It, like you said, Kaz, it was exactly that. It was somebody's friend. The claim from the Sasquatch Chronicles side of that kind of falls through, because there were about 4 or 5 individuals that were BFRO investigators that were there that night besides that individual that was there, and they all seen something, okay? That's something that I don't think really gets stressed here, is that the Humphreys claimed to see activity, So the BFRO comes in here, and what the BFRO comes out with at the end of this interview is that, yeah, they've definitely got activity going on there. The problem is that they're poaching, and they've got a bunch of deer carcasses lying around. They've got blood everywhere, and so they're basically drawing these things in because it's an easier food source and an easier source of their most prevalent meat that they have in the area. So, of course, they're going to come in here and try and get the free meal, you know? So, this is where all of these things started to coalesce into conflict, okay? No one's really arguing that there's Bigfoot on the property. That's the interesting part, okay? So, when you zoom out and you start looking around, you start to try and think to yourself, well, what does the locals think about this, right? Now, Honobia, like I said before, is a very low population area, okay? There's not a whole lot of people there. And from what I was able to gather in a quick investigation, it looked like the general consensus is that the locals backed up the Humphreys, not necessarily because they were just some good old boys, because apparently they had moved into the area. Apparently, it was because they also had experiences and could back up the fact that everything that the Humphreys said happened on their property at least correlated with the activity in town. So they at least believed that these guys, they're saying that this stuff happened the way it happened. The locals are backing up the Humphreys, okay? That is kind of telling to me. If these guys kind of moved in, now they could be from another township or another county, another state, doesn't matter. But the fact that they moved in, they had these issues, and the locals backed them up is kind of telling to me.
We actually did some looking into the matter, and usually one of the first things we do is we start calling around an area. Yeah, we went calling towards particularly the local library and any other official form, like say a town hall or anything like that, for information on the matter, and we got curt answers and then were hung up on.
To be a little more specific, they didn't actually have any of those. So when I was doing those interviews, just trying to find out there was just a bunch of cabin rentals. So that town is so small, they don't even have a post office.
They don't even have a post office?
Let
Oh my
alone
god.
a library. Okay, so they had like an RV truck stop area where they had like a restaurant, and then they had like 4 or 5 rental cabins that you could all hang out, like post to. But whenever we had called and we were trying to explain to them who we are and what we were talking about, why we were here, they were like, we don't really take calls, sorry, bye. That's kind of rough. Now, is that because something had happened or because they're just tired of getting harassed? That's kind of up to the rest of us to decide, right? But it definitely correlates to me with the fact that the locals, according to claims, also had their own experiences and decided to back up the Humphreys, right? This sounds like a town who's just trying to stay under the radar now. If you've got any questions about Bigfoot, don't talk to me. And well, apparently, according to myth, I think they were saying that they actually canceled their Bigfoot festivals. So, who knows? That could be something else. Now, if you've gotten this far and you actually like anything you've heard so far, give us a like, comment, and subscribe. There's quite a lot to be going on here in Honobia and with this entire conversation. And if there are any updates, we'll make sure to let you know. But for that, this has been everything with the Siege of Honobia. We hope you've liked it. We're the Southeast Bigfoot Research Organization, and you all have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.